Hello, everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome. Welcome back to another video over here on That's Comical. And if you're watching and it happens to be a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. This is a very, very exciting video because of the fact that it is not only a Let's Chat video that is going to be a launching pad for one of our newest segments over here on the channel that we're very much looking forward to, but we're finally here to introduce our newest member of the That's Comical crew. This is Teddy, my brother-in-law. I've mentioned him a couple of times on the channel. Teddy, I want to say welcome, and I really hope that you're excited for tonight's recording.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm actually looking forward. I got over the hump
And of
and I'm like,
course,
you know what? Let's do it.
Cammy is here, and Cammy is, even if Teddy wasn't here, you know, that Cammy and I would have tore the roof off of this conversation because this is going to be such a great discussion. I'm sure you're agreeing with me, Cammy.
Absolutely, it's right up our alley.
So we mentioned in the sizzle reel a couple of weeks ago that one of the segments that we're going to be bringing to the channel is our flashback segment, because I know that I have personally been mentioning that there has been somewhat of a very interesting revolution taking place in comics, but that is mostly because of what's going on with Image Comics and now the true competition between the Energon universe and the Ghost Machine universe, because these titles are just unbelievable. But there's another interesting thing that has been happening very recently. It's not something that is actually new to the world of comics, but for some strange reason, in the last 2 to 3 years, someone somewhere, I'm going to say in this case in Dynamite Entertainment, decided that we need to take this idea, which is nostalgic properties of classic television shows, mainly cartoons, and instead of just bringing these titles out to the masses, it's not going to be just the name and the familiar characters that they know and love, but we're actually going to put some very well-known or some up-and-coming, well-known talent attached to these books, artists and writers alike, and we're going to see what happens. And I'm just going to say, starting this trend specifically in, I think it really started like right around the pandemic time, but in 2023 and 2024, it's just been firing on all cylinders and just going gangbusters. And Teddy is someone who is relatively new to comics. He literally started reading comics just a couple of months ago. So the fact that this was when the Ghost Machine and the Energon universe, which also plays into the whole concept of nostalgic characters, the fact that these are brand new things that are taking shape, it's a lot less intimidating for someone who has never tackled comic books before to get into them. Cammy is also not as new as Teddy, but also still she classifies herself as somewhat of a newbie. I don't, because she knows who Marv Wolfman is. I'm going to take that to my grave. But Teddy, knowing that you are relatively new, how do you feel about titles like these that we're going to be discussing tonight coming out in the pages of comic books?
So I wasn't always the biggest reader, and when I discovered comics, it just becomes easy read. And now with these titles coming out, it's just so nostalgic. It becomes even an easier read, and I feel like I'm actually watching new episodes while reading.
Yeah, and you actually do get some of those titles to read with your kids. I actually like the fact that
Yeah,
they
we
sit
we
down
read
and read these
together.
titles with you
Yeah,
together.
yeah, we read together. It's great. They love it. So I'm
Yeah,
trying to get them to read a little more also.
that is awesome. So, where did this really begin? I would probably say that this all sort of started, I would say, somewhere between 2020 and 2021, maybe even 2019. And it was what was going on with two specific franchises that were really starting to catch on. It actually started a little bit earlier than that, but it really was the revitalization of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics, just because of the fact that Kevin Eastman came back to the comic books after not really doing much comic book work with the Turtles for a couple of decades, but just finding Tom Waltz and making this recent volume of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles turning out to be the longest running Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles volume of 150 issues. I think that was one of them. And I think another big one was an up and coming writer named Ryan Parrott over at Boom Studios taking on the Power Rangers. And what's so interesting about the Ninja Turtles and the Power Rangers that they've always seemed to be sort of going at each other. When the Power Rangers came out and became a phenomenon in the United States in the 90s, the Turtles sort of dropped out of relevancy because the Power Rangers were so much more popular. And then Chaim Saban and Saban Entertainment takes over the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle property, and then they show up in Power Rangers in space, and then before you know it, there's a 2003 cartoon, and then Nickelodeon takes the Ninja Turtles, and everything is officially up and running with the Ninja Turtles, and now they're more popular than ever. But
that's why you got to read Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the Mighty Morphin Power Ranger comic collaboration, because then you get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But there were some other titles that had even come out even in the 1980s and 90s, because Marvel, way back in the day, was taking on Transformers and G.I. Joe, and even, I believe, they even had Thundercats for a little while. And Dynamite Entertainment was also one of the big names to really start taking, and even Boom Studios, Disney franchises. There were Disney comics, even though we had seen Disney comics in the 1950s and 40s even, these were new properties, but for me personally, they really weren't hitting. I mean, like, I loved the fact that there were these properties coming into the pages of comic books, but even when Gargoyles came out, that sort of excited me, but I was like, am I really that big of a fan of Gargoyles? Like, who's really writing it? I'm not really sure. They just weren't grabbing me because I just didn't really know who was being attached to those books. But I wouldn't know if people were reading it or if people weren't reading it. Cammy, I'm curious, did you pick up any of those titles that were like coming out like in 2021 or 2022?
I did, yeah. I mean, I pick up pretty much anything with the nostalgia bug, I mean, when people talk about nostalgia in comic books, it's kind of a gray area, because I think that people lead into nostalgia with the high expectations of yesteryear. You want to have what your high was when you watched it on TV for the first time, or when you were introduced to it in the pages for the first time. But for me, because I feel like I grew up in the best generation, I'm a prodigy of the 80s and a child of the 90s. We have some of the best cartoons. And
That is true.
so anytime, it is hands down best theme songs, best cartoons.
Yes.
And we've seen it over the years with all of the reboots and the remakes and stuff like that. You just can't touch our generations, you can't. Because of that, I think that anytime I see, something that reminds me of my childhood, or something that I enjoyed either on the big screen or in animation form, I will gravitate to the book, and especially in comic form, because I want to give it a chance. I want to see what that creator has to possibly bring it to life. And I think that too, as any content creator, unlike you, Steve, I know that you go in knowing names, knowing either the ink, the artist, the writer, something of that facet. I don't. I pick up comics blindly 98% of the time, because one, I'm not as well versed in writers and artists and things of that nature as you are, but I also don't want to judge a book by its artist or its writer. I want to go in seeing what that creator has to offer, because obviously that writer is a fan. At some level, they are a fan, and they have something to tell. There's a story within them. Maybe it's something that they didn't see on the screen when they were watching it, or maybe it's something that sparked an idea when they rewatched it, for the 50th time. But in any event, I think that regardless of what is brought to the table, I think that it's new and it's fun, and it's someone's imagination, and I will give it a chance. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, the biggest series that I picked up was the Saturday Morning Adventures of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and that immediately reminded me of the show, immediately of the original show. And it just kind of snowballed after that. We started talking titles, you and I started seeing more and more nostalgic properties. I also picked up Gem and the Holograms, and I picked up Of course, Thundercats. But Thundercats, I was also a reader of the original comic book. So, that for me was just, okay, what's new? Like, what are we bringing to the table here? So yeah, there's a ton of titles, Steve, that I picked up pretty
Right.
much from the jump.
Well, you pretty much took the words out of my mouth, because all of a sudden, the Ninja Turtles. I want to get back to the Ninja Turtles, and we're going to do a separate video on the Ninja Turtles in general, because right now it has been a very long time since a major portion of Ninja Turtles entertainment has been found in the pages of comic books. I mean, think about it. There's no current TV show. There's no current film being announced at the moment. There's some in the works, but they're not coming out for at least a couple of years or so. And there are a couple of titles right now over at IDW. I mean, IDW, I know there's a lot of negativity around them. They lost a lot of properties, and Ninja Turtles is pretty much their lifeblood, but it's also because of the fact that they're just making some good comics. I mean, outside of the Tom Waltz and Sophie Campbell run, two events took place right after that. One was Tom Waltz getting together with Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, creating The Last Ronin, which was a phenomenon. But you're absolutely right, Cammie, out of nowhere. And it's really funny that I'm the one that's holding the book up, because you were the one that has been telling me to finally start reading the book.
I know.
When Eric Burnham decided to make Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Saturday Morning Adventures, this was the very first time that we had seen this version of the Ninja Turtles in the pages of comics since the Archie books. And the Archie books were extremely popular, but here was a situation where we had a writer who is not so well known amongst many. The art captured everybody because it looks like it came straight out of the cartoon. But you're absolutely right. You open up that issue, and what do you get? You literally get a brand new episode of the 1987 cartoon. And it had a quick title run, 4 issues for its first volume. It sold. And now, amongst so many other titles, it's got its own ongoing series now with 20 plus issues today.
I just picked up, I think, issue 21. Yeah, this week.
I think that it just came out, as a matter of fact. Yeah. And I actually got my first 5 issues of volume 2 in the mail. So I'm going to read them, and I'm going to see if I want to continue reading it. And it's not hard to hunt down the other issues. And I'll probably put it on my pull list too. But for me, the big part when it started for me to start collecting these nostalgic properties was the announcement of Robert Kirkman over at Image Comics saying that he's about to make a brand new universe featuring his own original characters and some nostalgic properties, and thus the Energon universe is born. But then when you see that Robert Kirkman, the man responsible for The Walking Dead and Invincible, now is writing his brand new comic book Void Rivals, and just to get everybody excited, that was the best part about it. Nobody knew that this was going to be that connected, because people already knew that there was a Transformers book on the way in November of 2023, and everybody was excited because Daniel Warren Johnson was writing it, and he's one of the best writers in the business. Teddy, you now know that name thanks to Transformers, and the moon is following us.
Yep.
And I think you also, and I know the both of you, I think, also read Jurassic League.
Yes.
That is a great
awesome.
read.
That was amazing. I had so
really
much
good.
fun with that. So much fun.
Yeah, so everybody was very excited, but no one expected in the first issue of Void Rivals to see legendary Transformer Jetfire show up out of nowhere. And then everybody said, oh my God, what is this Energon universe going to be? And then, of course, a couple more weeks down the line, they announced that there were going to be a series of G.I. Joe miniseries, and that Joshua Williamson, very well known over at DC Comics, was going to be the writer for the first 2 miniseries, Duke and Cobra Commander, and now he's writing the G.I. Joe series. And I just can't get over how great the Transformers and the G.I. Joe book is, because what's so interesting about them and all the other titles is the fact that these are original stories, they're darker, they're definitely for more mature readers, but they are still managing to capture that classic 80s nostalgia from those cartoons some way, somehow. Even in Transformers issue number 2, where Starscream pops the human's head off, you're still loving that character because you remember him from those old cartoons. I mean, personally, I don't really remember the old Transformers cartoon. I love the movie though, but I haven't watched G.I. Joe and Transformers in years. But even so, I still remember all these characters and I still love all these characters.
Just this morning, I highlighted the Transformers cartoon on my Saturday morning reel for Instagram. Every Saturday morning, I try to share a cartoon from yesteryear. So it's funny that Transformers, you say you haven't watched it. I've just gotten through a couple of seasons of it. And it's funny though, because a lot of it I don't remember, but going back and watching it as an adult, I appreciate it so much more. And I think that's to be said kind of about this conversation we're having, is that those kids, us, we grew up and we still love what we love. And to see now that we're creating new stories in these worlds that we grew up in only stands to reason that it would be darker, it would be a different take on it, because popping a human's head off in the 80s wouldn't have been favorable, or it wouldn't have been televisable. However, now we get away with so much, I mean, there's almost lack of censorship in some cases. I watched some kids cartoons today and I'm like, oh my god, I pray for parents, because I would not want to be a parent of young children these days. It's really difficult to sit your child in front of TV and walk away, because you kind of always have to monitor the jokes. And I get it, I mean, it happened with us too. A lot of the jokes were over our head because, obviously we didn't get the humor and so forth. But I think that, in terms of the nostalgia that's being rewritten in a darker form, we are the kids that stayed with these stories. We watched the cartoons over and over again. If there was any kind of tangible books or novelizations that were written about these shows or these cartoons, we were reading those too. And so now you have these content creators that are writing these darker storylines, because really at the end of the day, that's what we want to see. And I know Teddy and I, being horror lovers the way that we are, we embrace the dark and we appreciate it when someone gets a little bit off the rails, especially with something that you love, because you can see the availability of the darkness in a lot of these characters. And Transformers is definitely one of those franchises that, it held back a lot because of the era that it was created in. But there is a lot of darkness to be had and a lot of dark stories to be told. And the fact that it's happening now, I think, is why we're seeing the success of a lot of these nostalgic titles, because we are getting, for the first time, it feels like, what we've wanted all along.
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, Transformers being on broadcast television back in the 80s, yeah, there was a lot that they couldn't get away with. But in the movie in 1987, I mean, they did something that you never would have expected. They actually killed off a major character, and there even was a curse word thrown into that movie or two. So the fact that they definitely were trying to tell darker stories and trying to get what they could into those stories was great. But that's the other thing I love so much about particularly the Energon universe, because even though these are nostalgic properties that are based on these old cartoons and even some old comics, I really still love the fact that it's really this group of people that are trying to tell a whole new story with familiar faces. I mean, Teddy, I don't know if you ever actually got a chance to watch some of these cartoons, because I know, look,
Yeah,
just so
I
everybody.
mean, I have plenty to say about this, because we're talking about dark and we're talking about nostalgia, and I'm just thinking specifically about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I grew up with it. I loved it. I watched it. And as we grow up and evolve, so does the show, and and the comics. And what I notice is that when I was a kid, it was a kid show. When I'm an adult, those comics are dark, and I feel like it became more adult as we grew up.
Yeah, and I also don't think you know this, Cammy. Teddy is actually an '80s kid as well. He just he arrived at the tail end of it. He was
Yeah, he's like my
88,
sister.
88.
88.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's like my sister. My sister and I are 8 years apart. She's the prodigy of the 80s, but the tail end of the 80s. So and I speak to this for Teddy too, I feel like we can group you in. You are a part of our generation because you understand what we grew up with. Alongside us as you were getting older, you were subjected to watching the cartoons that we watched because you had, siblings or cousins or something that were older than you that were saying, "Hey, come watch this with me," or "Hey, I'm watching this, come sit beside me until I finish it," and I did that with my sister. And there was a lot of things that she probably wouldn't have been exposed to if it wasn't for me exposing her
Right.
to that. But I feel likewise because I feel like my sister, which is, I think, more so that speaks to your generation, Teddy, you're the Nickelodeon kids. And I
I
think
am.
that without you and your generation, I wouldn't have been exposed to that because my sister introduced me to the whole world of Nickelodeon, which I probably would have been too grown for at the time. And she's like, "No, you
Right.
got to come watch this. You make me watch your stuff. Come watch this with me." So because of that, I feel like anyone born from like 1980 to like 1995, honestly, we are the chosen ones. We had the best of everything: toys, games, TV, comic books. Everything was at our disposal. And now comic books like this are a prodigy of that. And I want to also say, Steve, speaking to the darkness, think about too how many of us in that same age range or that time period that I just mentioned were watching horror movies way before we should have, because it was not as it was not as sheltered. I watched Freddy Krueger for the first time at the ripe old age of 4. Should I have been watching that? Absolutely freaking not. But I implore anyone, it was not my mother's fault. She tried really hard to shelter me from that. She told me many times, "I told you to turn the TV off." But every time she walked out of the room, I turned it back on because I had to know, who was this guy with knives for fingers. So my point is that I think that in that darkness, watching all these beloved kind of goofy cartoon characters, on the side Saturday nights we were watching Skinamax, as we called it, because that's where the horror movies were at. That's where I was introduced to Pinhead and Chucky and a Puppet Master. And those same people that were like me, cartoons in the morning and horror movies at night, are now writing these comic books, and we're getting kind of that lace. And I think that's too why we're seeing such a beautiful lay and a variety of horror comics also now. And I'm loving it. I'm here
There's
for
so
it.
many.
And that's the most interesting thing because, horror comics, when they were first really being introduced and showcased to younger audiences back in the 40s and 50s, that was basically the whole reason why the Comics Code was created and how everything went very, very family friendly and campy in the 60s and 70s, all the way until creators like Frank Miller and Alan Moore came around and said we need to go back to our
Yeah.
dark roots. So now, because we really are back in the true essence and the true naked state of what comic books originally were, that's why we have all of these independent labels and all of these creators that are creating these kinds of stories. I mean, we would never have had a Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees back in like the 1960s or 70s. But you also did mention something very important, Cammy. You mentioned that Teddy was part of the Nickelodeon generation, but you also have to remember he's also part of the Cartoon Network generation, because the Cartoon Network is the reason why, even though there were on the big network television back in the 80s, you could watch a rerun of Looney Tunes or the Flintstones or the Jetsons. But when Cartoon Network came around and all these younger generations were being exposed to all of these cartoons from the 60s and 50s and 70s, not to mention later on when Adult Swim would come out and anime would officially make its true mark in the United States, and now it's more popular than ever. That's another reason why the comic book industry and the companies that are taking on these nostalgic properties are doing what they're doing, because even 80s children know these old cartoons. And that's really where it gets going in 2024, because we had gotten two big comic books that came out in the early portion of that year. The first one was over where before Dynamite really exploded in the nostalgic scene in 2024. They gave us a brand new comic book of Thundercats by Declan Shalvey, and it's very different from the cartoon. And I really, really am enjoying it. Believe it or not, it was only supposed to be 12 issues. They were only going to continue it if it actually sold, and it sold. And we're now going on 15 issues, which is wonderful. And the other big one also came from a smaller company, Mad Cave Studios, just in time for the 1990 film's anniversary, decided, let's bring Dick Tracy back.
Oh,
And Dick
yeah.
Tracy turned out to be one of my top 5 books of 2024 because I love the 1960s cartoon. I remembered even I remember Fox 5 here in New York decided to rerun the 60s cartoon the year that the movie came out, and that was when I got to watch this old cartoon. My dad used to watch that cartoon. That was what was so cool about it. And so I remembered the cartoon. I remembered the 1990 film. The 1990 film is bright and exciting, but there's a real dark tone to it. So when you read the pages of that Mad Cave Studios comic book, you get that true noir detective story, and it's simply fantastic. It really, really is. I mean, I know you're both reading Dick Tracy.
I am.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
I'm a big Dick Tracy fan, from the movie that you just mentioned to the 1960s cartoon, which I have on box set. And, I think that's another thing that speaks to our generation, because we were very fortunate to have a lot of those. I think it was on Boom Network.
Boomerang.
Where we got, Boomerang, there we go. Okay, yeah. Where we got our parents' cartoons, and we got
Pink
the cartoons
Panther.
of yesteryear.
Yep.
And Pink, there you go, Pink
I
Panther
would love
and
a Pink Panther comic book. That would be
Looney
fun to read.
Tunes and yeah, I mean, so we definitely have that nostalgia line that just runs right through. And so to have something like Dick Tracy make the pages in, a modern day is just perfect, because it once again reintroduces a fan favorite to a new generation. And I love that.
Yeah, but then May 2024 came around, and then, all of these titles that we mentioned, they may have opened the door, but then one title in May of 2024, a writer who had sort of been getting a lot of negative press, David Pepos. He was doing a couple of titles over at Marvel, and a lot of comic readers here in the YouTube community were not too fond of the most recent title because they didn't like what he did with the Punisher. I mean, Punisher is just like an anti-hero. He's gritty, he's dark, he's very violent, and nobody really liked the way he treated this character. But then all of a sudden, there's an announcement that over at Dynamite Studios, David Pepos is going to be writing a Space Ghost book. And that is where two very interesting things take place. Yep, exactly. But as you know, Cammie, I like to get the nostalgic Hanna-Barbera cover looks, and that's the interesting thing. When you take a look at a lot of Hanna-Barbera, because they really hadn't been tackling Hanna-Barbera properties, there was, even though Hanna-Barbera's cartoons were definitely, child-friendly and definitely on a little bit on the campy fun side, there was a lot of action cartoons that Hanna-Barbera made. I mean, Space Ghost, Mightor, Shazam, Birdman, the Galaxy Trio, the Herculoids, Johnny Quest. There's a lot of action from Hanna-Barbera in the 60s and 70s. So they're like, let's work with these. And so Space Ghost comes out of nowhere. And, I heard about David Pepos, and I was like, I don't know if I want to read this book. I don't know if I really want to read this book. And then I just kept saying to myself, I want to read this book because it's Space Ghost. And as someone who has not watched many episodes of the cartoon and never even watched much Space Ghost Coast to Coast, I guess it was just the name that stuck, and it was just like, I've got to check this book out. Issue number 1 blew me out of the water. And every issue after that, it just got cooler and more exciting. I like that everything that makes the Space Ghost cartoon is in there. Even the monkey. Even the monkey doesn't ruin this book. Blip is just still a great character. Jan and Jace are great. Seeing the main villains like Vitor and Zorax and Brak in a whole new light, very dark, very violent, and yet it still feels like a 1960s cartoon. I mean, guys, you both are reading this book. You know how much I love this book, but what do you guys feel about this book?
Yes. So honestly, I don't have any nostalgia to it. I knew nothing about Space Ghost except I knew the name Space Ghost. I picked it up because you said, Teddy, you got to read this thing. I'm like, you know what? I'll take any recommendation that you give me, Steve. So I went, read it. It's amazing. I read the second one, amazing. I read number 6, made me hysterical cry, and I just kept going. And honestly, it's not just that it's Space Ghost. It's not about the nostalgia. I think overall, it's just a good comic. It's just a good read.
Exactly. And David Pepose has, I said this in a previous video, I'm not going to say that the doubters ate crow, but again, they wanted to read this book because it was Space Ghost. That's the main reason, and that's the power of the nostalgic name and the famous face. The fact that these titles are coming out and people know these cartoons, even if they never watched the cartoon, they know the cartoon. And if it's something that they're interested in, they're going to want to pick that book up. And that's why people picked up Space Ghost. And because of how well it's done so far in sales and how so many people are writing, I love when I go to my comic book store and I'm getting my books and Space Ghost is one of those new books. And another person who's like buying their comics sees that book and he's like, or she says, how is that book, by the way? And like, my eyes light up, the manager of the store's eyes light up, and some other random person's eyes light up because that person just happens to be reading it too. We all turn around and say, oh my God, you have to read Space Ghost. You're going to love it. And the best part is, these are people that most likely grew up with the cartoon and probably watched the cartoon. So it's a big seller, and David Pepose right now is on he doesn't have that many titles yet, but he's writing. I talk about Marvel Comics and how far they've fallen from grace. There's very few titles over at Marvel that I'm actually enjoying. And out of nowhere, one of them just happens to be a 5-issue miniseries called Cable, Love, and Chrome, featuring a very famous X-Men character. Why are people buying it? Because David Pepose is writing it. And what is he giving us? A fun, action-packed X-Men story. Everybody's liking it. Very few people are enjoying the main X-Men titles, but people are reading this 5-issue miniseries because he is writing it. And I cannot wait. It's only March, but you guys know that at the end of April, David Pepose over at Dynamite will be giving us Captain Planet, issue number 1. I am so excited to see this take on this character.
It's going to be big.
And I am excited for Free Comic Book Day to pick up Speed Racer issue number 0, because David Pepose will be writing Speed Racer. And that's the other interesting thing. The nostalgic factor and these comics are doing so well to the fact that anime series are turning into Western floppy comics, not additional mangas, Western comics. And Dynamite Entertainment and Mad Cave Studios seem to be the ones outside of IDW over with the Turtles and Image with the Transformers doing it right, because one of the biggest comics that I'm reading right now, and I picked up the Free Comic Book Day, was Cullen Bunn's Gatchaman from Mad Cave Studios. I know that this is one of the most iconic animes ever created in the 1970s. I never watched it, not even when it was actually Battle of the Planets or G-Force on network television here in the United States. Heavily edited, by the way. But I always knew that there was something important about this story, this title, And Cullen Bunn, who is mostly well known for horror, when he does science fiction or adventure, I get very excited because I want to see how he's going to go past the horror. All three of us read a book of his that is fantasy that we all loved last year, and that's The Autumn Kingdom.
Oh my God.
Love that
Yes.
so much.
Oh,
And we want more. We all want more.
we do.
But he's writing this book, and I freaking love it. It's fun. It's colorful. It's action packed. It's such a fun read. It's making me even more interested in finally watching the anime. I mean, I have it on my Amazon wishlist, the complete series in Blu-ray format. I've got to get it. I don't know when, but I know I have to have it because now that I'm actually reading this comic book, I'm starting to get to know these characters, and it reads like it reads like not even an anime. It just reads like a great Saturday morning cartoon. And I know that you guys may not be reading this, but I am going to shout from the rooftops, this book is great. It really, really is. And I love the fact that the East is getting these titles. I mean, Speed Racer is going to be one of them. I mean, what's going to come next? Is there going to be an Astro Boy comic? That would be fun.
That would be interesting.
I think.
I just want to make a comment about what you said about you have it in your wish list, Amazon wish list, and you want to see it. I read all of Invincible. I know there's an Amazon show. I didn't watch it. I was waiting till I finished the comics, and it was incredible comics. I started watching the show. I couldn't do it. I couldn't get into
Really?
it. There's just something about reading a comic and you have it, going on in your head and you picture everything that's going on, and then when it comes on television, you're like, this is not what I expected. This is not what I pictured. But that could just be me. I don't know.
Well, you want to
Well,
know
not
what's very-
everything translates well, and I say this to people all the time. Don't judge a book by its movie, and vice versa. There are occasions where the movie or the adaptation or series will hit because it's what you expect. But I think, again, you have to keep your mind open when going into movies and series because it is not going to be the read. And I think that oftentimes as readers, because for me that's what I am first and foremost, I don't go into a movie or a series with the same expectations of the book that I just read or the comic book series or whatever, because again, it's a vision of a creator and their vision is not going to be the vision of the creator of the comic or the novel.
Right.
Also, the constraints on time, there's budgetary constraints, there's time constraints, and some things, I think Harry Potter comes to mind a lot when I have this conversation. Some things just don't translate well to screen. You can only
100%.
see them in words, so I understand completely. Some things are not your bag and you will set them aside, but maybe give it a year or two between, I call it palate cleansing, and try to go back and watch the show. You might enjoy it for different reasons, or you might find, it's not for you, and that's fine. There's no reason why you have to enjoy a read and its adaptation.
I agree, 100%. It was
Also,
perfection.
well, and that's too, that's a very good point. When you love something and connect with something so deeply, it's almost impossible to find a movie or a series that's going to meet your expectations, because you are going to nitpick the ever loving crap out of it and it's going to become even more unenjoyable. So there's nothing wrong with just saying, you know what, that's not for me, and move on and go back and just reread the pages again. That's okay too. I did want to also make a point too before we get too far off into left field, Steve, when you were talking about Space Ghost. I wanted to kind of interject there and say that, oftentimes too, when it comes to writers, there are good writers who write bad things, and
That is true.
then there are bad writers who write good things. And so I think sometimes when critics are a little bit quick to jump the gun and base their opinions on a person based on either the last thing they read or the only thing they've written, it's very unfair. Give a person an opportunity to grow and advance, because part of being a writer is expanding that. And as you write, you're going to get better. And some people don't.
Oh, that's
There's some
true.
authors that I read that they're utter crap from start to finish. But at some point, you walk away from that writer. But I think, like in his case, I went in with very high expectations because I loved both the original Space Ghost and Space Ghost Coast to Coast. So my expectations were, I'm pretty sure this is going to be a great book. But I think it's unfair sometimes that writers are just coined with the last thing they wrote or something a critic said. Critics are their own enemies. They don't even like themselves. So when somebody says they don't like something, that's the first thing I gravitate to. When somebody hypes the shit out of something, that's the last thing I go to, because I don't want to read what everybody else is reading. I want to read what everybody's not reading.
I mean, you're absolutely right, Cammy. I mean, look at the name like James Tynion the Fourth. Look at how many great things he's written, and look at how many horrible things he's written. I mean,
That man
yeah.
he's got to be highly medicated. I'm his brain. His brain. Like, okay, I love him. I do. I read everything the man
Look, the
puts out.
Department of Truth is solid gold. That's some of the best writing.
Down top 3 comic books of ever. I love that so much because it's just me in all facets. But when I get into his like Blue Book series, for example, it's like, how much time does this man have to do all of this research? Like, what does his brain look like? When I think of James Tynion, I think of his brain being like a filing cabinet, and it just kind of Rolodexes through. Okay, I'm going to talk about this today. I mean, the amount of knowledge that man possesses is just beyond fathomization.
Yeah, and then you've got like, a name that we just recently threw out. We threw out the name Garth Ennis. He's also a very well-known writer, has written a large amount of stuff that is very praiseworthy. But when
he's also one I would hold up a doll and ask where he was touched as a child.
Yeah, because when I read Batman Reptilian, as much as I loved the artwork by Liam Sharp, that is one of the weirdest, most I don't even know how to truly pinpoint the description of Batman Reptilian. It was a
Some
bizarre
people just have an
book.
innate ability to really find the dark inside them. He is one of those people.
We all knew that. I mean, for crying out loud, he wrote a book called The Darkness. I mean, that just says it all. But no, I mean, like, I also feel that in some ways, and I don't know why it is, but I feel that when we sort of work backwards in a sense that here's a movie or here's a television show, now let's turn that into something on the pages. I feel that because there is your only reference is like 30-minute episodes or a 90-minute film, there's so much more room in that proverbial sandbox to play in, and you can create so much more with just so little to reference. I mean, Saturday Morning Adventures is completely different because you're talking about 10 seasons of Ninja Turtles, so many characters, so many different stories, so many different personalities. In that case, let's take these characters and let's put them in some different situations. Let's give them something to really chew on. So that's why that story works. Space Ghost was a show that only lasted for a year. I mean, another great story that came out, Joe Casey's Johnny Quest. I really enjoyed that book, and I'm so excited in this month because of the fact that Space Ghost and Johnny Quest are going to meet in the comics.
And I love
excited that Joe Casey is going to write it. I love the fact that that is happening. But again, Johnny Quest had, I think, 2 seasons of a 1960s show, and then there was a 1980s season, and then there was The Real Adventures of Johnny Quest, which lasted for 2 years. So that's 4 years of work that you could capitalize on, but there's so much. But that's the thing. As someone who loves and watches lots of Johnny Quest, there's a show that has a lot more to play with. So you can totally see that, because what you got in that, I don't know if it's going to continue. I don't know if this is all we're going to get from this Johnny Quest title. It was a situation that Johnny Quest and Haji and his dad and Race never tackled before. So it was something new and exciting, and yet it still felt like you were watching the real Johnny Quest show, which I really, really liked. And there are even some titles that are out there that you're not necessarily going to like. I mean, the fact that Jeremy Adams is writing a Flash Gordon series, Flash Gordon is just not necessarily something that I personally know. I never watched the movie and I never read any of the old comics, and that's the same reason why I didn't try to get the Defenders of the Earth miniseries, because that's actually just about wrapping up. I never watched the cartoon, so it wasn't
But I think
necessarily.
that's kind of an unfair point, though, because you just said the same thing about Space Ghost, and yet you went all in on Space Ghost. So I think
But
inherently it just has to speak to you as a reader, though.
well,
You did,
that's partially true. I mean, again, Space Ghost, even though I never watched it, like I always knew who he was, and I always had some kind of a liking towards it. Flash Gordon was just something, like I read it, and I just didn't
I don't
like
think
me.
you necessarily have to be 100% familiar though with the baseline of a TV series, a cartoon, whatever the case may be, a movie, in order to jump into something to read it. I mean, like I said, for a lot of the material that I pick up, it's based on a cover by or a recommendation. And so I think that if you go in with a little bit of nostalgic knowledge or love or appreciation for something, obviously your desire to carry through the series is going to be greater, but it's not necessarily going to hook, line, and sink you, because again, the nostalgia gray area of, am I going in with real high expectations that this is going to meet all of the high that I had when I watched or
Yeah,
experienced this years ago. It's a hit and miss kind of thing, and I
yeah.
think that if something grabs you, whether it's the cover or the writer, the ink, whatever the case may be, give it a try. Just because you're not familiar with its history or its origination doesn't mean that you're not going to innately enjoy the series.
No,
I
I
mean, like,
100% agree with that because
yeah,
if you don't mind, this is something I was thinking about for a while as Kevin was speaking, where it's nostalgia is there. Nostalgia is a big part of it, but I think the biggest thing which Cami spoke about was how this is also new for a lot of people, and it's important that we have this line that we say that kids nowadays have no idea how good we had it. You know what? We're giving them an opportunity to know. We're
exactly.
giving them an opportunity to see what we grew up with. We're giving the opportunity to read and have that feeling of, oh my God, this is amazing. I can't wait for the next one. Just like we had to wait a week for the next episode. So it's really there. I miss those, but it's there. It's there for them also. It's
Yeah,
not just the nostalgia part, but it's also for anyone that really hasn't read it yet and can connect at some point like we have in the past.
yeah. I mean,
Agreed.
like, one of the other things that I really didn't get a chance to talk about was the fact that there's a lot of Disney books out there right now. I mean, Teddy, are you still buying the Lilo and Stitch book, or were you buying the Lilo and Stitch book for your kids?
Yeah, I'm still getting them. I'm reading with my kids, and it's great. It's like it's like watching an episode. That's what these
Yeah.
things are. It's just watching an episode, but instead you're just reading it. It's fantastic. Also, Sesame Street. I read Sesame Street with my kids, and it is awesome. And I'm not gonna lie, I wish they made more. I really do. And every single one of them had a purpose and had a lesson taught. Yeah, you go. They have a great lesson for kids and also
Yes.
honestly for adults. And it brought me
Yes.
back and it was great.
I think
Biggest.
sometimes we forget how many lessons we learned watching Saturday morning cartoons, not only in the shows that we love and that we still talk about to these days. Think about all the intervals between cartoons, all those little segments that we had, that were commercials, so to speak, that, palate cleansers between these shows. And we learned things and we shared things, and it was science and math and all of these amazing things. And so, to have a comic book as juvenile as Sesame Street might seem to have in my collection, it's part of who I was. It's the foundation that makes me who I was or who I am
Hmm.
now, because even though I'm not regularly watching Sesame Street on television, it still airs. And to see that you're now sharing it with your children, Teddy, is amazing, because we learned lessons, years ago, and now they're being given in these pages of these comic books. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of my biggest disappointments was when they announced that there was going to be a DuckTales comic book, and I loved that show growing up. And so I picked up the first issue, and it just I don't know what it was. It didn't feel to me like I was reading a DuckTales comic. What it felt to me was it felt like one of those classic Disney comic books that was written like in the 40s and 50s, and it just featured the DuckTales characters. I don't know. I didn't feel that true sense of adventure that I felt when I used to watch DuckTales as a kid.
DuckTales is one of the best cartoons ever made. To
Of course
think
Ever.
that you could even remotely replicate it in the pages is just absurd. It's not something that can be done, but I think that's a great comparison of don't compare oranges to apples, because you cannot compare the cartoon series to what
Correct.
we got in the pages of that new comic book. I
And
love the comic book. I might just be, the Disney nerd that I am, and I will forever vouch that I think that there's a lot to offer when it comes to Disney, and the comics that they produce, like Teddy alluded to earlier, they just feel like an episode that you're watching. It might not be the best episode, but it's an episode and it's part of the journey, and it's definitely not the show, but I don't think its intent from its creator was ever intended to compete with the show.
yeah,
A fan is a fan, no matter what, and I think that as a fan, we're all entitled to have our own visions of what that means to us, what it meant to us, what it still means to us. And yeah, DuckTales is just one that can't be touched, no matter how you try to introduce it and slice it. The series stands on its own, but also, like Teddy had mentioned, this is the opportunity for us to share with new generations the things that we still love so much. And if we can get a kid to pick up a DuckTales comic, that's pretty cool, in
yeah.
my
I mean,
opinion.
it's not on my
Yeah.
pull list, but Cammy, I don't know if it's on yours, but I believe this week
is.
Darkwing Duck #1 is coming out by
Yes,
by
and
by,
it's
by a good
definitely a
writer too.
highlighter because
Dan
I am the gum that
Kibblesmith.
sticks to the bottom of your shoes.
Yeah, Dan Kibblesmith is writing the Darkwing Duck book, and I've read some of Dan Kibblesmith's work, and it's good, but I don't know if I want to buy the book or not, but I would be very curious to know how it ends up being.
I will
So-
share that with you.
So
because
speaking
it is on my
about
pull list.
speaking about comic books that feel just like episode that because that's what I'm saying. There are some of these books that definitely feel like they're their own thing, but then there are these ones that just really feel like if you turned on the television and you just read it and you know exactly what it is. Teddy, which one am I talking about?
Powerpuff Girls.
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, when I found out that Kelly Thompson was writing it, I was really excited because Kelly Thompson is one of the best female writers in comic books. And when I read that first issues,
Oh my God.
it was like I just watched an episode of
It was
the Powerpuff
perfect.
Girls.
Perfect.
That was one of the best comic book reads that week when I picked it up. And that's the funny thing. It may not be my top pick, but every single time a Powerpuff Girls issue comes out, I get so excited because I know I'm going to love it. And I remember you and I having that conversation, Teddy, when they announced that there was going to be a new writer every 3 issues. We got a little bit nervous about how it was going to feel, but I still remember issue #4 because issue #4 featured the Townsville Bake Off. And oh my God,
It was great.
Cake puns. So many cake puns. I just couldn't stop laughing.
Yeah, I also want to say, Judge, I also want to say, when we go and read these nostalgic comics, we kind of have a voice, right?
Yeah.
We hear a voice when we read certain things. So, for example, you read Mojo Jojo, you know what he's saying in that voice. So when I'm reading them to my daughters and everything, I'm doing Buttercup's voice, I'm doing Mojo Jojo's voice. And when we're going and reading these in their voices, even in our heads, that's where the nostalgia and that episode comes in.
And
I
some
just
of the
got done saying that
ideas-
to Steve about Saturday Morning Adventures with TMNT. That's exactly what happened to me from issue #1. The voices just started to play and I could not turn them off.
Yep.
I'm 21 issues in and I still can't turn them off.
And I
and
still
that
also
is beautiful writing.
And I still remember the story from issue #2 of Powerpuff Girls and how much I loved it. It was the Mojo Jojo story where he said, I can defeat the Powerpuff Girls by going into their dreams. And yet
Yep.
he goes into their dreams and he still can't beat them. I thought that was such a great idea.
It was really good.
Because you read it and you feel that could have been a cartoon on television, and you could have seen that on television. You would have loved it. I love that kind of writing. That is wonderful. Because like I said, it's new, but at the same time, the women who are, because that's what I also like about the Powerpuff Girls. It's all women writing and artwork. It's all women doing it. And oh my goodness, they are true appreciators and fans of the Powerpuff Girls. They're just giving the fans exactly what they're coming for. They're coming for Powerpuff Girls as they remembered it, with entirely new stories, and they're just killing it. They really, really are. We're only 7 issues in. I think
so.
maybe 8, and I just love every single issue when I read it. And I'm so excited to discuss those titles with you guys. But I mean,
yeah,
there's just so many other titles that are coming out that when they announced that Ed Bryson was going to be writing Silverhawks, my inner child just leaped out of my skin. I was like, this is like one of my all-time favorite cartoons from the 80s. And we're only 1 issue in, and I already love it. So,
it's a good intro.
Something new. I'm getting something new. And that's what I love so much about Dynamite, because they're the ones, along with Mad Cave and IDW, but it really mostly is Dynamite. They're the company that's really trying to capture this nostalgia, and the thing that I'm loving so much is that they're picking the right properties. Every single title, maybe minus 1 or 2, just intrigues me so. The fact that we're going to be getting a one-shot of Wacky Races in April, I can't wait.
That's awesome. I know. That's going to be great.
I cannot wait to read that. And there's so many, but that's the thing. It's like, you see how well all these titles are doing, and you're wondering, like, will there be others, and what will they be? Like, I personally, I said this a long time ago, but I would love a SWAT Cats comic, because that was one of my favorite Hanna-Barbera cartoons. It was just that was a 90s cartoon, by the way. That was action-packed, so much fun. I believe the voice of Donatello was one of the cats too, which I also really liked. So that's one of my favorite cartoons. It ran for 2 years, and I loved it. I would really be surprised, maybe not necessarily, but we've already got Thundercats, we've already got Silverhawks. There's another cartoon in that realm that we haven't seen yet, and I don't even remember watching it as a kid, but I vaguely remembered, because I just, for some reason, I recognized the images, but I don't remember the show at all. But there was a show called Tiger Sharks. It was part of this.
Oh my goodness! You don't remember Tiger Sharks? That was like the Yes, absolutely. That had the best toy line too.
Tiger Sharks was Thundercats underwater. That's what it was. Same company. Yeah. So I'm just like saying to myself, if Thundercats is doing well, and we're still waiting. We only have 1 issue of Silverhawks right now, but Silverhawks is Thundercats in space. It's like, if Thundercats is successful and Silverhawks is successful, why not make a Tiger Sharks title? I think people will read it.
I think there is so much opportunity on this nostalgia vibe that we have going on right now, that you could virtually pull so many shows out of your hat, whether it be from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and even some cases the 2000s, which we just alluded to with the Powerpuff Girls. I just think that there is enough in this for everybody, and if a writer has a whim, I think now is the perfect opportunity to put it on paper and write it, because I do think that we are in a really good vibe with this, that we are going to give it a shot, whether it's just the first issue, the first arc, whatever the case may be. But I think that we're all willing to give this a chance. So I'm hoping we see a lot more titles, because I'm really excited for this nostalgia bug that's been biting these writers.
I have a feeling that there will probably be a Mask series. I think a lot of people will eat that up. That's a show that everybody loved when it was out in the 80s. I would love to see so many others. Just like my Bionic 6. Do you remember that one, Cammy?
do. Yes.
I would love to see
Very
a
good
Bionic. I think a
cartoon.
Bionic Six comic would be wonderful. I mean, if they can give that like the show was very Fantastic Four like because it was a family of heroes. I
Yes.
would like. Oh man, you know how many people would die for a Centurions book?
Now you're talking. Yeah, there's opportunities. The world is the oyster of the writers right now, and I think that if we continue to, invest in these comics, talk about them, breathe life into them, sit down, have these great conversations that we're just so famous for on this channel, I think that we can continue to encourage other readers, whether this is something that someone's revisiting or they're visiting for the first time. I think that this is a conversation that was worth having, and I think that we just need to have these conversations with our friends and fellow readers, encourage other people to pick up titles. And if you love something, gush about it. It doesn't matter if I like it or Steve likes it or anyone else likes it. Just talk about it, because there's plenty of that I gush about that Steve's like, really, Cammy, you're reading that? What's wrong with you? I don't care. I love it.
I have that too with
Well,
him also.
yeah, well, that's basically a great way to say, where is this discussion going? Well, this is basically going to turn into a series here on this channel where we're actually going to dive into some of these titles that we've been talking about. And we're going to bounce around, of course, but we're definitely going to be taking a look at these titles and we're going to be talking about them by the story arc because we really are trying to spread the gospel here because as pop culture fans and comic book readers, we really want people to know that these things are out there. Whether you watch these shows as a kid or you only heard of them by name, we want you to know that there's some good stuff out there. And we want to just have some great conversations about things that we truly loved and have loved for very, very, very many years, which is great. So I think we're going to have a lot of fun. So when our official first flashback episode comes, we're going to be tackling the first story arc of Dick Tracy because we do want to also celebrate the anniversary of the 1990 film. Speaking of, I actually just got it on eBay. It should be coming in the mail any day now. I got it for like $7, so it was a
Nice.
steal. It's a movie that I haven't had in my collection and have been saying it really should be there. So I'm really looking forward to not just watching the movie again, but getting together with you guys and maybe some other people on the channel and actually talking about the first story arc of this book because Dick Tracy is definitely a good book and more people need to read it. So
100% agree.
So thank you very much for watching, everybody. Leave a comment. Let us know about the fact that are you reading any of these books? Which ones do you like? Which ones do we not mention that you'd like us to talk about? Hopefully, there's an very good chance we're probably reading them. But anyway, also subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're up to date with all of our latest content. And we will see you in the next one.